September 30th, 2026 will mark 60 years of Botswana's independence. Ordinarily, such an anniversary would be a moment of celebration. A nation would look back with pride and forward with confidence. Yet, as this anniversary approaches, many Botswana find themselves in a reflective mood. The economy is struggling, businesses are closing, young people search for jobs that just never seem to appear. Even government revenues are under pressure. For the first time in many years, there is open discussion about economic decline, debt, and even the possibility that Botswana's best days may already be behind her. It is a strange moment. When independence arrived in 1966, Botswana was among the poorest countries on earth. There were few roads, little industry, limited prospects, pretty much nothing on the horizon. Then came the diamonds. Over the next half century, the country experienced one of the most remarkable economic transformations in modern African history. A generation grew up believing that each year would be better than the last. Yet, 60 years later, many citizens are asking an uncomfortable question. Have we come full circle? Not completely, of course. Botswana of today is not the Botswana of 1966. Now we have schools, hospitals, universities, and institutions that were built through decades of hard work, resilience, and sacrifice. Yet the uncertainty many people feel today forces us to ask another question. If the economy no longer inspires confidence, then what exactly are we celebrating? Of course, some will point to peace, others will point to democracy, others still will remind us of the extraordinary economic success that transformed a poor protectorate into a middle-income country. And all of that is true. But when asked why Botswana survived when so many African societies disappeared, many people immediately think of the famous journey of the Three Dikgosi to Britain in 1895. Yet, by the time Khama, Ndebele, and Batuing boarded a ship for England, the most dangerous battles had already been fought. The story begins much earlier. It begins with their fathers. It begins with a generation of leaders who faced threats, not merely to their governments, but to the very existence of their people. See, for much of the 19th century, the Tswana world stood in the path of successive waves of storms and destruction. The Difaqane swept across southern Africa, destroying kingdoms and scattering entire populations. Armed raiders crossed the interior. The Ndebele descended from the east. The Boer commandos advanced from the south. And later came the British imperial ambitions, bringing a different form of conquest. Again and again, Tswana communities found themselves confronting forces larger than themselves. The outcome was never guaranteed. Had a handful of battles been lost, had a few leaders made different decisions, had certain migrations failed, the map of Southern Africa might look very different today. Many Tswana communities south of the modern border eventually found themselves absorbed into what became South Africa. Their descendants remain there to this day. The people who became citizens of modern Botswana are, in a large part, descendants of communities that successfully defended the territory, preserved political authority, and maintained enough independence to survive until the colonial era and beyond. But you see, that survival was not accidental. It was won. This series tells the story of the men and women whose actions changed the fate of a people. They were not perfect. They were not saints. But because when their nation stood at the edge of destruction, they made decisions that shaped the future. As Botswana marks 60 years of independence, we look beyond presidents and politicians. We look beyond the republic itself. We return to the age of warriors, of migrations, invasions, diplomacy, and survival. We return to the heroes who made Botswana possible. By the early 1800s, the Tswana country stood at the center of a storm. For generations, communities had risen and fallen. Kings had fought kings. Cattle had been raided, and territories disputed. But nothing in living memory prepared people for what was about to happen. Beginning in the early 1820s, a chain reaction of wars spread across southern Africa. Entire nations were uprooted. Villages vanished. Cattle changed hands again and again. Thousands fled into deserts, mountains, marshes, and distant lands. The Tswana called it the time of destruction, the time of the wars of Ndebele. History remembers it as Difaqane. This was the darkest generation in Tswana political history. And it came in two waves. First came the great Sotho-speaking war bands. Then came the Ndebele of Mzilikazi. The first great collision came at Dithakong. Dithakong was the capital of the Batlaping. Word had already spread across the country. Large war bands were moving westward. Among them were forces associated with Mantatisi and other displaced Sotho-speaking groups. They came with warriors, but they also came with wives, children, cattle, captives, and everything they possessed. This was not a raid. It was a moving nation. They approached Dithakong. The Batlaping prepared to resist. They were joined by mounted Griqua horsemen carrying firearms. But victory at Dithakong did not end the destruction. The storm simply moved elsewhere. After defeating the Bangwaketsi and driving Sibetwane northward, Mzilikazi turned his attention to Tswana communities in the Western Transvaal. There, his regiments swept through Bakwena, Bakhatla, Bahurutsi, and other Tswana chiefdoms with extraordinary brutality. Entire settlements were destroyed. Those who resisted massacred. Those who resisted were massacred. The survivors fled into the hills, the Kalahadi, or sought refuge among neighboring Tswana nations. Between 1827 and 1832, Mzilikazi transformed the conquered country into the heart of the Ndebele kingdom. He built powerful military capitals at Kangwini, Dinaneni, and Hlahlandela. After conquering Mosega, he turned it into his southern military headquarters, guarding the road to Kurumane. He later established another great military town at Egabeni, near the Great Madikwe River. By 1829, his kingdom stretched from the Vaal River to the Limpopo and numbered nearly 70,000 people, many of them captives taken during his campaigns. Many Tswana settlements and villages in the region laid abandoned. Even Robert Moffat, who visited Mzilikazi in 1830 and admired his intelligence and dignity, witnessed the contradiction of a ruler capable of great kindness and terrible violence. That same year, Mzilikazi defeated 3 Zulu regiments sent against him by Dingane, confirming that the Ndebele had become one of the greatest military powers in southern Africa. In 1832, his armies destroyed the Barolong settlement of Kunwana and completed the conquest of much of Hurutsi country. One of the greatest casualties of that era was Kaditsweni. Already weakened by earlier attacks during Difaqane, the once magnificent Bahurutsi capital was left in ruins. Its survivors scattered westwards, northwards, and eastwards, carrying with them memories of one of the largest Tswana cities ever built. Farther east, the Bangwaketse now stood in the path of advancing armies. Their king was Makaba, one of the greatest military leaders in Bangwaketse history. Makaba met the invaders in battle. Against enormous odds, he defeated elements of the Sotho alliance and forced them southwards. For a moment, it seemed the Bangwaketse had halted the tide. But victory proved temporary. Another enemy was already approaching. Unlike the earlier invaders, they did not simply pass through. They fought to dominate. The Bangwaketse and Makololo clashed repeatedly. During one of these confrontations, Makaba was killed. His death shook the kingdom. The Bangwaketse fragmented. Refugees scattered in several directions. A kingdom that had stood strong only years before now struggled for survival. After defeating the Bangwaketse, Sebitwane turned towards the Bakwena. The target was Ditubaruba. It was the capital of a fragmented Bakwena. The Makololo seized the town and occupied it. This was no brief raid. They settled there as conquerors. Once again, the Bakwena dispersed. Some fled into the Kalahari, others sought refuge among the neighboring peoples. One branch under Murua Khomu eventually found safety among the Batawana. The political center of Bakwena power had fallen. The occupation of the Tubaruba did not last forever. A new Bangwaketse leader emerged, Sebeho. He gathered strength. He rebuilt alliances. Then he struck back. Sebeho drove Makololo from Kweneng and ended their hold over the Tubaruba. For one of the first times during Difaqane, a Tswana kingdom had reversed a major conquest. Driven northward, Sebitwane next entered Bangwatu territory. The Kutso Hills became the center of conflict. Kari and his people were forced from their settlements. Cattle were taken, homes abandoned, men slain. Bangwatu joined the growing tide of refugees moving across the interior. Still moving north, Sebitwane turned against Batawana. The first attack weakened them. The second proved disastrous. Large numbers of captives were seized and carried away. These captives would help build Sebitwane's new kingdom farther north. By the time he reached the Zambezi, he had transformed himself from a refugee warlord into an imperial ruler. While the Tswana communities struggled to recover, another power was rising in the east. Its ruler was Mzilikazi. Its armies were the Ndebele. The second hammer was about to fall. As mentioned earlier, Mzilikazi had established military settlements in Tswana country, and one of the most important was Mosega. It became a launching ground for repeated invasions. From here, regiments moved against Bahurutsi, Bakwena, Bangwaketse, and others. The heart of Tswana country now contained an enemy capital. The Bangwaketse were attacked again and again. Many communities retreated deep into the Kalahari. Yet the kingdom survived, and eventually it struck back. One of the most celebrated victories in Tswana memory occurred in the Kalahari Desert. Sebego lured Ndebele force deep into the desert, far from reliable water, far from support. The invaders became trapped by thirst. Heat and exhaustion did what weapons could not. The Ndebele force was destroyed. For once, the desert itself fought on the side of the Bangwaketse. Around 1837 and 1838, the Ndebele forces entered Bangwatu territory around Shoshong and the Kuzo Hills. This time, resistance hardened. Tribute collectors were killed. Submission was rejected. Bangwatu chose defiance despite the risks. The conflict became one of the defining struggles of the period. Later on, the Ndebele would pursue the Batwana. The Batwana retreated into the Okavango. The Ndebele followed. It was a mistake. The invaders entered a landscape of channels, islands, reeds, and hidden waters. With the assistance of the Bayeyi canoe specialists, the Batwana turned the delta into a battlefield. Tradition remembers Ndebele warriors being drawn into dangerous waterways and drowning in large numbers. The invaders had mastered open country, but the Okavango was a different world. By the end of the 1813s, Tswana society had survived two devastating storms. First came the migrating Sotho armies, then came the Ndebele military state. Kings had fallen. Capitals had been occupied. Entire communities had disappeared. Yet, the Tswana were still there. The Bangwaketse endured. The Bakwena endured. The Bangwatu endured. The Batawana endured. The Bahurutsi endured. The Barolong, the Bakata, and many others endured. The old order had been shattered, but it had not been destroyed. Out of those years of fire and wandering, a new Tswana world would emerge. By 1837, Mzilikazi's kingdom faced an unexpected coalition. The Boer commandos advancing north were joined by Bahurutsi and Barolong communities that had suffered for years under Ndebele rule. They were not fighting for the same cause. The Boers sought land, the Tswana sought to reclaim that country. Together, they struck at the Ndebele kingdom. After a series of defeats, Mzilikazi abandoned the western Transvaal and led his people north towards present-day Zimbabwe, where he established a new kingdom. The first Ndebele kingdom had fallen, but its collapse created another struggle. Then immediately began the Boer chapter. The departure of the Ndebele transformed the political map of the interior. For more than a decade, Mzilikazi had driven Tswana communities from their ancestral lands. When the Ndebele threat finally passed, many attempted to return home. But what they found was another occupation. Boer settlers had moved onto their abandoned land. The destruction of the Ndebele south of the Limpopo did not bring peace. The Dutch-speaking settlers who had left Cape during the Great Trek were now in their land. By the early 1850s, conflict between the Boers and the Tswana had become unavoidable. The center of resistance was Kwening. Its ruler was Sechele I. Sechele understood that the threat facing his people was not a passing raid. It was a permanent struggle for land, for cattle, and for political independence. When a large Boer force under Andries Pretorius advanced towards Bakwena territory, Sechele called for allies. Warriors answered from several communities, Bakwena, Baka, Baliti. Together they gathered at Dimawe. Dimawe was Sechele's capital. It is located between Mankodi and Manyana today. They put up a spirited defense against the Boers who came looking for the Bakata Bahamanana. They were a slaving force who thought that Africans were destined to be their servants. When the attacks came, the hills erupted with gunfire. Large stones were hurled down against the advancing commandos, but they found themselves fighting an enemy who refused to break. For 2 days, the battle continued. Neither side could secure a decisive victory. Unable to crush Sechele's defenses, the Boers turned their attention elsewhere. They descended upon Kulubeng, a few kilometers away. Kulubeng was the former capital of this Bakwena of Sechele. There they looted property of David Livingstone's mission and property that belonged to other Europeans. They carried away large numbers of cattle, women, and children, including Sechele's own son, Kari. To many observers, it appeared that the Boers had won, but the war was not over. Sechele and his allies remained in the field. Tswana regiments launched retaliatory raids against Boer settlements. Livestock was recovered. The frontier remained unstable. Within months, the Boer advance had stalled. Negotiations followed. The Tswana could not be subdued as easily as weaker frontier communities. They possessed firearms. And above all, they possessed political leadership capable of organizing resistance. The struggle for Tswana independence was far from over. But at Dimawe, Sechele proved that conquest would carry a price. The defeat of Mzilikazi transformed the political map of the interior. For about 12 years, the Ndebele kingdom had dominated much of the country north of the Vaal River. During those years of war, many Tswana groups abandoned their lands. More than a dozen communities fled westwards and settled among the Bakwena of Sechele. There, they waited for the violence to pass. When the Ndebele threat finally collapsed, many survivors attempted to return home. The lands they had fled were no longer empty. The Boer settlers had moved in. Farms had been established. Boundaries had been claimed. Territory abandoned during the years of war was now being treated as Boer property. The same violence that had scattered Tswana communities had opened the door for Boer settlement. The destruction caused by the Difaqane and the Ndebele wars created the very conditions that made Boer expansion possible. They now found themselves occupying lands from which African communities had only recently been driven. To them, these territories appeared vacant. To Tswana communities, they were ancestral homelands temporarily abandoned during a time of war. As Boer settlements expanded, another problem emerged. Farms required labor. Cattle required herders. Wagons required drivers. Boer authorities increasingly demanded labor from neighboring African communities. Some chiefs supplied workers under pressure. Others refused. Many communities had already lost large numbers of men through the years of warfare. Their own fields had to be cultivated. Their own cattle had to be tended. Their own families had to be fed. Simply surviving required every available hand. Many chiefs could not spare workers without weakening their own communities. The result was conflict. Commandos began raiding African settlements. Cattle were seized. Women and children were carried away. Young people were forced into labor arrangements that many African communities regarded as slavery in all but name. 1852 was a cursed year for Botswana. Britain and the Boers signed the Sand River Convention. The agreement recognized the independence of the Boer Republic north of the Vaal River. Just as importantly, Britain abandoned direct responsibility for African communities living in that territory. For the Tswana rulers, the message was unmistakable. A powerful European government had effectively recognized Boer control over their lands. The struggle that followed would lead directly to Dimawe. But another force was already emerging beyond the horizon. The Boers had sought land. They crossed the frontier looking for farms, grazing land, and independent republics. Cecil John Rhodes sought something much larger. The Boers dreamed of republics. Rhodes dreamed of empire. The Boers wanted territory where they could settle. Rhodes wanted a continent he could control. His vision was tied to the new imperial age that followed the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885. Across Africa, European powers were dividing territories on maps and claiming lands they had never governed. Rhodes intended that the country between Limpopo and Zambezi would form part of that imperial project. For that dream to become reality, two Tswana rulers mattered more than any others. Sechele in the south and Khama in the north. Their territories sat astride the route needed for the telegraph lines, for wagon roads, and eventually railways linking the Cape to Cairo. No imperial corridor could be built without passing through their lands. Unlike Sechele, who remained deeply suspicious of outside control, Khama increasingly saw advantages in cooperation with Britain. He believed that British influence offered protection against Boer expansion and renewed Ndebele aggression. That calculation would shape the next chapter of Tswana history. For more than 60 years, the Ndebele had cast a shadow over Tswana country. It began with Mzilikazi. His regiments swept across the Transvaal. They destroyed villages. They carried away cattle. They drove whole nations into exile. Makaba fought them. Sebego fought them. Sechele fought them. Sekgoma fought them. An entire generation of Tswana rulers had lived beneath the threat of Ndebele invasion. Now another generation would finish the struggle. Mzilikazi was now dead. His son, Lubengula, ruled the Ndebele kingdom from Bulawayo. Although his kingdom was smaller than his father's, it remained the greatest military power between Limpopo and the Zambezi. Its regiments still raided neighboring peoples. Its authority still reached towards Bakurutsi and Bangwatu country. Far to the south, another man began pursuing his own ambitions. His name was Cecil John Rhodes. Through the British South Africa Company, he intended to conquer the country beyond the Limpopo. But before his empire could expand northward, Lubengula had to be defeated. Rhodes assembled a powerful force of mounted volunteers, artillery, and modern rifles. He also sought African allies. Among them was Kgosi Khama III of the Bangwatu. Khama did not join the campaign out of loyalty to Rhodes. He joined because the Ndebele had been enemies of his people since the days of his father. For decades, they raided Bangwatu cattle, threatened Bangwatu settlements, and claimed authority over parts of Bangwatu country. To Khama, this was an opportunity to end a war that began long before he became king. They crossed into Ndebele territory. On the 2nd of November 1893, the armies met. Ndebele warriors charged in great numbers, just as their fathers had done for generations. The Bangwatu fought fiercely alongside the company troops. By midday, the Ndebele assault had collapsed. Lubengula abandoned Bulawayo. Before leaving, he ordered his capital to be burned rather than to allow it to fall intact into enemy hands. Smoke rose above the city. The Ndebele king disappeared into the north. His kingdom would never recover. For Tswana communities, this victory carried a meaning far greater than Rhodes imagined. It marked the end of more than 60 years of Ndebele aggression and near domination. The enemy that had driven Magaba into battle, that had scattered Sechele's generation, that had haunted the fathers of Khama, was gone. The Ndebele kingdom had fallen. But another empire was already taking its place. Rhodes had sought an empire. Rhodes dreamed of a continent. Years earlier, Sechele had fought to stop Boer expansion. Now another empire wanted to cross the same country. British Empire and the Boer republics were now competing for control of southern Africa. Years earlier, the Berlin Conference had encouraged European governments to divide Africans amongst themselves. No Tswana chief had been consulted. Yet, maps of Tswana country were being drawn in distant European capitals. If Britain did not secure Bechuanaland, Rhodes might, or the Boers might. In 1885, Britain proclaimed the Bechuanaland Protectorate. Many Tswana rulers saw something else, another foreign power claiming authority over their country. Their reaction was divided. Some Dikgosi rejected outside interference altogether. Others believed that British protection offered the only realistic defense against Boer expansion. Among them was Khama III. He had seen what happened south of Molopo. He knew how quickly independent African land could disappear. The protectorate preserved Tswana self-government to an unusual degree. The Dikgosi continued to govern their own people. Their courts remained. Their land remained largely in African hands. But everyone understood the future of the country was no longer entirely their own to decide. 10 years after the protectorate was declared, the greatest challenge was still to come. Cecil Rhodes had not abandoned his dream. He wanted Bechuanaland transferred from the British Crown to his British South Africa Company. If that happened, the protectorate would become another company territory. Settlers would follow. Land would be taken. The fate of the Tswana country might become no different from that of Rhodesia. Three Dikgosi decided to act. Between the first of the Bangwaketsi, Khama III of the Bangwatu, Ndebele III of Batswana. They were not beginning a struggle, they were continuing one. Their fathers had defended Tswana territory with rifles and shields and spears and with courage. Now their sons would defend it with diplomacy. They traveled thousands of kilometers to Britain. They met politicians. They met church leaders. They met journalists and ordinary citizens. They explained that Tswana country was not empty land. It was governed. It was peaceful. It possessed its own laws, its own rulers, its own future. The British public listened. The government listened. Rhodes did not get Bechuanaland. The protectorate remained under the crown. The railway would pass through Tswana country, but Tswana country would not become Rhodesia. The victories were never complete. The protectorate was still a colony. Britain still held ultimate authority. But something remarkable had happened. Most Tswana land remained under Tswana control. Villages expanded, cattle herds recovered, schools were built, mission stations grew, and the Dikgosi continued to govern alongside the colonial administration. The country endured. You see, Botswana did not emerge because it escaped history. It emerged because it survived history. Makaba resisted the Mantatisi and the Makololo. Sebego rebuilt a shattered nation. Sechele defeated the Boers at Dimawe. Sekgoma held together the Bangwatu through the years of invasion. Khama ended the Ndebele threat. Sebele and Batuing stood beside him in Britain. Together, they protected the country in different ways. Some fought with spears, some with rifles, some with words. On the 30th of September 1966, the Bechuanaland Protectorate became the Republic of Botswana, a nation that had endured the Difaqane, the Ndebele invasions, the Boer expansion, and imperial ambition, had survived to govern itself. That is why Botswana exists today, not by accident, but because generation after generation chose to defend it. When people tell the story of Botswana, they often begin in London, with the Three Dikgosi standing before the British government in 1895. The journey to London did not begin in London. It began in the battlefields. It began at Difaqane, where Tswana communities stood against the first wave of destruction. It drove the Barolong from Kunwana. It continued at Lotlhakane, where Makaba fought until he fell. It continued at Ditubaruba, where Sebego reclaimed his father's country. It continued in the Kalahari, where Bangwaketse turned the desert into a weapon. It continued in the Okavango Delta, where Batawana turned water into a fortress. It continued at Dimawe, where Sechele proved that Tswana country would not surrender. And it ended not with rifles, but with words. The fathers defended the land, the sons defended the future. Makaba, Sebego, Segotsane, Sechele, Sekgoma. And then came another generation, same struggle. They inherited more than chieftainship. They inherited unfinished work. Their fathers had preserved a country. Their sons preserved its freedom. On the 30th of September, 1966, the Bechuanaland Protectorate became the Republic of Botswana. The flag that rose that morning did not belong to one generation. It belonged to every generation that had refused to let Tswana country disappear. Botswana was not born in 1966. It was born every time its people chose not to surrender. That is how Botswana became Botswana.